Hello everyone, good afternoon to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to this special session where we are going to take a look into the important current affairs which have been in news for the portion of environment ecology for the past couple of months. Now, this session will cover some of the important topics relevant for the prelims as well as the mains examination, as well as it will contain the list of protected areas which have been in use, the prominent protected areas, and some of the prominent species which have also been in use during this entire period. So basically, the sources that we are referring to for the coverage of this entire portion is a wide gamut of sources coming from Down to Earth magazine, then the Hindu, the Indian Express, and even the case of Hindustan Times. So a wide gamut of newspapers and magazines have been referred to, and also when it comes to certain reports, then in that case the website of World Meteorological Organization, etc., that serves as a source for this particular session. So this session is supposed to be a quick recap in case you have attended the previous UCAN sessions or the previous current affairs sessions. This is supposed to be a quick recap, and in case we have not looked at the current affairs of environment and ecology for some time, then this is a session which you should not miss. So what are the topics that we are going to cover today? So in total we are going to have a coverage of around 13 different topics, 4 of them relevant both for the prelims as well as the mains examination. Then few of them, again another 4 to 5 of them, that is dealing with the places and the species in use, the protected areas in use, protected areas, and then the species. Okay? Because the trend that you will observe is UPSC will ask you questions from those areas and those species which have remained in use, and even when it comes to national parks and wildlife sanctuaries, rather than simply looking at all the various national parks and wildlife sanctuaries and ratifying it, just focus on those particular national parks or protected areas which have remained in use, and your job will be further eased up. Now, before we initiate the discussion of the topic from the first one, that is Plan B, an important announcement for all of you that we have come up with a lucrative offer of 19,999 plus 12 months free extension, and we are back with the Unacademy CSE Assure program, whereby if you take a 2-year subscription or more, then your responsibility, or basically your success, becomes our responsibility. If let's suppose you are unable to clear the examination, or if let's suppose you're not satisfied with the outcome of it, then the next year's preparation is on us. Now, this is not to boast some aspect out there, but it is to show accountability, that what is being inculcated or what is being propagated as a source of information that is reliable, and that has been vindicated even in the mains paper and the prelims paper year after year. Now, you can use the code IS English and gain more discounts associated. Now, starting with the first topic, that is Plan B. Now, what is this Plan B? This is a topic which had been appearing in the portion of the magazine of Down to Earth for the past couple of months now. And time again, it is being repeated. The last time the article appeared was in the month of August as well. So that becomes important for your examination if a topic is being stressed upon to such an extent. Now here, the topic talks about, or the entire discussion is about, when we talk about bees, honeybee for example. Now these honeybees, they are the pollinator species, whereby they help in pollination of various different species of plants and various different species of fruits and vegetables that we consume on a daily basis. Due to factors such as anthropogenic intrusion into these areas, human intervention, that is, construction activities, deforestation, as well as the role of climate change, this bee population has been dwindling in many parts of the country. And sadly, we do not have enough data or study to back our understanding about how do these bees behave, where do they migrate, if at all, and so on and so forth, due to which, for example, in states like Himachal Pradesh, where growth of fruits and vegetables had been a mainstay for cultivation and agricultural portion of the economy for a long period of time, there the agricultural produce is reducing. This has also been observed, for example, in the case of apple cultivation and orchard farming, where the farmers are facing the brunt because of reduced rate of pollination. And that is because of the dwindling amount of bees that are naturally available in that area. So that has also, in a way, created a new employment opportunity or a new economic opportunity. In the region of Himachal Pradesh, you will find that there are multiple different beekeepers who are in great demand. They go to the certain farmlands with the pack of the bees and the boxes of bees, and they leave it out into the wild to allow them to naturally pollinate the various different fruits. So that is something which is required going ahead into the future. Otherwise, our horticultural produce, which even though has crossed the milestone of around 330 million metric tons, is going to face a decline and eventually impact the farmer income as well. So what is this entire Plan B about? So that is about the role of honeybees as pollinators. Now, for those who are not aware about it, what do we mean by these pollinators? So, for example, when we talk about the reproductive propagation in the case of plants, now how would they multiply? So that is where you have these fruits and the buds in these flowering plants, where the honeybees, they basically end up gathering the nectar, and in the process they carry the pollen grains. Then they will sit on another flower and pollinate that. So as a consequence, there is pollination and the creation of, or the procreation of, the plant species. That helps in early fruiting and maintenance of healthy genetics, particularly in the case of fruit species. So their number is declining. So what is the reason for the decline in number? So when we talk about the reasons for decline, in number, the first reason is very simple. This first reason is about the human activities. Now, those of you who are getting confused that Plan B is the name associated with a government program to keep the jumbos away from the railway track, you are correct in that regards. That is where the term Plan B is originally used. That using honeybees, particularly in the region of Assam, to keep the jumbos or the elephants off the tracks to reduce the railway-induced disasters. But then, what Down to Earth as a magazine has been approaching this lack of pollinator species is termed as Plan B. So that is why it is being termed like that. So please don't get confused. There is a separate program where honeybees are used to keep the elephants away from the tracks. And this is the case where you need to formulate a plan to ensure that the honeybee population is healthy, particularly when we talk about the urban environment. That is where the agricultural prospects are reducing due to rapid rate of urbanization. Okay, I hope that is clear and that removes any kind of confusion thereby. So human activities, rate of urbanization is very rapid. Urbanization. Then after that, deforestation. Then after that, you have the natural factors. Natural factors such as role of climate change. Now what it does, it basically reduces the natural habitat and the natural habitat range for these bee species, and that is where their overall population is impacted. Now once the population gets impacted, then the rate of pollination goes down. And as we observe the reduced rate of pollination, you have multiple consequences. First of all, healthy genetics of fruits or plants are not propagated. are not propagated. Okay. And the second impact of this will be reduced production, particularly in apple orchards. Production. And that will have its own socio-economic impact in terms of the reduction of farm income and overall the impoverishment of the agricultural sector. Agricultural sector in these hilly states, that becomes a mainstay, right? Orchard farming is one of the main primary occupations in this area. So that is why if your overall production goes down, then you will never have that great amount of prosperity coming into that region, and that impacts the supply chain cycle as well. Now, after that, the important area of biodiversity that we are concerned with. So if you take a look at the region, particularly around Himachal and Jammu and Kashmir, you will observe that it lies at the basic boundary of Palearctic and Oriental, the biogeographic realms. So across the world, depending upon the types of various different species, various different taxa, the biogeography of the world is divided into various regions, which are also known as biogeographic realms. So when we talk about these biogeographic realms, so here the region of the mountainous areas in the Himalayas, that lies at the boundary of it. So that is why whenever you have the impact of climate change, let's suppose in the Palearctic region, that also induces migrational patterns and impacts in the region around the Himalayas. So that needs to be studied further. So this is the issue. We have understood what is the issue at hand, why that issue persists, and we need to understand the pollinators, right? So the region is dependent on agriculture, fruit crops like apples, apricots, cherries, oil seeds, pulses, vegetables, all of them, they are dependent on the pollinator species. And we also have very little information for the pollinator species in higher altitude. We have an issue about the pollinator species in urban areas also, but also when it comes to higher altitudes, the information that we have is further restricted or limited. So high altitude solitary bees, they end up demonstrating certain kinds of adaptations, certain kinds of variations, right? But you need a complete taxonomic understanding. Okay, so even the case when we talk about butterfly population, that butterfly population is also impacted due to climate change. So that is why the need of the hour is to understand them in a better way. Now, when we talk about, for example, these are the case studies that you will be able to see on your screen. When you talk about, for example, the nocturnal pollination of certain moth species, that is not even documented in the Himalayan area, right? Hoverfly population, that is also very vital for pollination in these mountainous regions. They have also not been studied till now. So that is why we need to carry out systematic study in order to understand the bee population and ensure that you have healthy population of bee which continues to exist in these mountainous ecosystems. So that is what you will find in the way forward: comprehensive taxonomic survey, detailed phenological study, and emerging migration patterns. These are your way forward that you can accumulate. Now, the question which can be framed from this: discuss the impact of climate change on critical pollinators. Now here, mind you, you have to give the example of the pollinators as well. You cannot have a simplistic answer, because in GS paper 3, you will generally find the questions which do ask you about what are the examples which you will give. So that is why when we say critical pollinators, so in this case, the hoverfly, the nocturnal moth species, the butterfly population, the honeybee population, and you have to separately tackle the urban areas as well, where urban horticultural production is getting impacted. And even when we talk about, let's suppose, the case of mountainous areas and the natural forested ecosystem, there also the impact is substantial. Okay, so here, what do you write in the intro? So in the intro, you generally have to address the role of pollinators. Role of pollinators. So pollinators allow for natural reproductive propagation in the case of the fruits, vegetables, and general plant species across various different areas of biodiversity. Right? Now, these become critical in ensuring the propagation of healthy genetics and also maintenance of overall productivity. So that will be your introduction. Don't mention climate change in the introduction. Okay. Now, once you have completed the introduction, then after that in the body, talk about the case of rising temperatures, then increased frequency of forest fires, Okay. So these are something that you have to mention. Then you also have to talk about the cases of anthropogenic impact very briefly. Anthropogenic impact. Now, in this case, you do have to link it to the case of the Palearctic and the Oriental biogeographic realm. Boundary of the Himalayas lie at the boundary of two biogeographic realms. Okay, Palearctic and Oriental. So that also needs to be mentioned and substantiated. Okay. Now, because it is a 10 marker, you don't have much of a scope to write about the way forward. You have to give examples of this, and eventually your conclusion will be the kind of way forward that you provide in the answer. And what will be your conclusion? Your conclusion be the need of the hour is to conserve these pollinators, carry out greater scientific study, taxonomical studies about these pollinators moving ahead. Okay, so that is what is required to be written. Then we come to a state of climate in Asia 2024, the report which has been furnished. Now, this is mostly relevant for the prelims examination. Having said that, you can quote this report in general questions in the mains exam as well, as a manner of substantiating your answer, as a manner of providing factual evidences to what you have written. So, state of climate report. So, how do you prepare that for the prelims? So, whenever you are confounded with any case of reports, for your prelims, what becomes important is you have to ensure that you know the organization which is bringing out this report. Organization, major findings, right? And with these major findings, also implications of them. That can be asked in multi-statement question in the prelims exam. What is the implication, for example, of the rising temperature in the oceans? How will the ocean warming impact biodiversity and in general the entirety of biosphere? So that is where you do need to know about these factors when you are preparing for your prelims examination. So first things first. So it is an annual report released by World Meteorological Organization. Okay, it is an annual report. Now, because it is a report about Asia, state of climate of Asia. So what this report has focused upon is the number of extreme climate events in Asia, the rate of warming of oceans in Asia, the rate of warming of land masses in Asia, the need to have a coordinated strategy for disaster management, and the number of extreme disasters which have been occurring in the entire Asian region. So that is something which has to be, or which is comprised of in the entirety of the report. So Asia is warming at twice the global average. That is the first finding. Now, this is the same case in the situation of the Arctic region as well, where the rate of warming is almost twice the global average. Sea surface temperature recorded a generalistic high, and so is the case of the land areas as well, that the temperature was at its extremity in 2024. Marine heat waves were worst on records, and that marine heat wave has induced a rise in sea level, threatening the small island nations, but at the same time inducing the aspects like coral bleaching. The mass coral bleachings have been observed. glacial melt in the Asian region has accelerated. After all, when we talk about the Himalayan region is also what is referred to as the third pole of the world because of increased amount of glaciers and glacial activity which is to be found in this area. Right. So when we talk about the Himalayan region, so there the glacial melt is more. Certain areas in Central Asia, they have experienced disappearance of certain glaciers. However, there is an anomaly. There is an exception when it comes to glacial melt. And which is that exception? It is the region of Karakoram. Karakoram mountains have been experiencing a retention of glacial activity, a continuation of glacial activity, and in certain areas, increased amount of snow as well. Having said that, that is also an outcome of climate change because now the cold winds, which are generally carried by the Western disturbance front, these cold winds continue to act till the month of July and August as we have seen this year. So as a consequence of that, the Karakoram mountains, they do experience increased snowfall and that is known as Karakoram anomaly. Then floods and droughts destroyed lives and livelihoods. The number of extreme weather events have increased and the requirement of the early warnings and action, how that can save lives. As you would be listening to this particular session, you would be flooded with news stories about the case of more landslides, more cloudbursts. One day you hear about more cloudbursts in the region of Uttarakhand. Another day you hear about the cloudburst and landslide in the region of Jammu Kashmir, in the region of Katra, in the region of Himachal Pradesh. So this is increasing in terms of frequency. And the devastation caused by each one of them is very high. So first of all, the rate of warming is ever higher. Now, this chart indicates to you the findings from the various different sources in terms of the satellite mapping and so on. Now, this chart, by the way, most of the candidates will tend to ignore it, but if a question is asked like it was in this year about rising sea level impacting the small island nations. Now, those of you who would have attended the sessions and looked at the case of World Meteorological Organization's report of rise in sea level, you would have looked at the chart as well. If you were able to incorporate that chart into your answer writing, your marks would be definitely at least 2 marks, 1.5 or 2 marks more in that answer as compared to your competition. So you can imagine the difference that you can create in the case of 4 to 5 questions and in general the approach that you can take in your GS. So the level of warming has been accelerating and this is a case of a uniform increase which has been or which is being observed. Okay. Now, then Asia warmed at around 1 degree Celsius above the 1991-2020 baseline. Okay. Now, this is also used in the prelims paper. This fact is also, or these facts can be tweaked and can be used in the prelims multiple choice question paper as well. Right, that Asia is warming at 4 times the rate of global average, whether that is a correct statement or not, or Asia has experienced a temperature rise of 3 degrees Celsius as compared to the baseline of 1980. Now, you might think that it is very factual, but this is a basic understanding that you have to extract out of a report. So when you take a look at the report, don't simply ratify annual report by WMO. Go into the details of it. Very important. Okay, warming rate from the past couple of decades to 3 decades has been twice as compared to the 30 years prior to that. Okay, so the rate of warming is increasing and as a consequence, the heat wave cycles, the drought cycles, they are becoming much more frequent and much more common along the way as well. Now, when we talk about, let's suppose the impact on oceans due to heating, what is the impact on oceans? So when we say oceans, due to heating, first of all, there is thermal expansion. Now this thermal expansion will mean thermal expansion of water. Now what this will mean is rise in sea level, isn't it? Now that rise in sea level threatens the coastal biodiversity. Coastal biodiversity. Okay. Now, when we say coastal biodiversity, what do we mean by that? So, for example, the mangrove population. Mangrove population. International Day for Conservation of Mangroves was also celebrated on 26th of July. So there were multiple articles throughout the last month about the role and the importance for the conservation of mangroves. Because we have covered it so substantially and so frequently in our newspaper analysis, that is why I'm not bringing it to the table, but then that becomes an important factor nonetheless. Then other than that, due to heating, you also have the case of coral bleaching. Coral bleaching. And when that coral bleaching happens, biodiversity population declines. It has an economic cost associated as well. Okay? Economic cost in the sense of reduced production from the fisheries. Okay, and reduced economic output from the fisheries. So that is where you have the declining income factor which is associated. Okay, so it impacts the economic output. Then increased amount of heating will also trigger mass migrations. Away from the tropics. And this is already being observed in certain species such as the humpback whales, where the migrational trends are increasing in terms of how far the species are able to migrate, right? So this is also a factor whereby you are observing with the passage of time that more number of species are moving from the region of the tropics into the temperate areas. Because when we talk about the marine species in general, by their nature, they come into the category of being stenothermal. Stenothermal means what? Temperature tolerance range. Tolerance range for temperature is less. Okay. And there's a reason for that they have typically evolved in an area or in an ecosystem where the temperature does not change rapidly. It is not the case that like the terrestrial habitat, the aquatic habitat also experiences sudden increase in temperature. No, the temperature is maintained in a consistent level, consistent manner. So that is why the species have evolved to be stenothermal rather than being eurythermal. So when your temperature tolerance range becomes very less, with the marine heat waves, your ability to adapt in that region experiences a substantial decline. So the species have no other way to go but then to migrate away. This is also what is referred to as the term tropicalization. Tropicalization, again, which has been in use throughout the past year. So here, always ensure that you have certain examples of this migration. So humpback whales can be one of those examples. Okay, they are migrating to faraway distances. So that is the major impact that you will observe or experience in the case of oceans. There are other impacts also, indirect impacts. For example, let's suppose when the ocean gets heated up. So what happens? As the average sea surface temperature rises, then the low pressure created in the tropical regions, they become much more intense. Once the low pressure becomes intense, it always generates frequent and devastating cyclones. So as a consequence, the disaster cost gets exaggerated. So cyclonic events are also there, but that impacts human population in greater number and the biodiversity associated in the land areas due to territorial flooding. Okay, for example, we have been observing increased frequency of cyclones in the Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal as well, and that has caused flooding in the coastal areas. Whenever there is flooding in the coastal areas, it always does impact the natural population of the biodiversity in those coastal regions as well. So these are some of the issues associated, but the most major issue that the oceans are confronted with is the mass bleaching exercise. So we are already witnessing a case of 4th and 5th mass bleaching of the corals in the tropical regions in the recent time. So that will get more frequent and prominent as we move ahead. So the impact on oceans: marine heat waves affected nearly 15 million square kilometer, comparable to 10% of the Earth's ocean. Average sea surface temperature in Asia rose at a level of 0.24 degrees Celsius every decade, which is twice the average. So the temperature of the landmass, that is warming almost at twice the average, right? Even when we talk about the temperature in the case of oceans, that is also getting warmed up at twice the average. And this is impacting the small island nations in great numbers. Okay, this is a map of the thermal image that you associate with the oceanic regions, where you observe that the temperature has been rising continuously. Okay, now after this, the impact of this increased heating basically will mean extreme climate events. Extreme climate events like what? For example, you can take the case of floods, become more common, cloud bursts become more common, heat waves, they become more frequent, cyclones become very common, drought cycles, they also end up getting more common. So these are your extreme climate events basically, and these extreme climate events, they are getting much more common by the day. Then other than that, you also have the case of the coastal inundation or coastal submergence. We already have the case of the capital city of Jakarta undergoing that submergence or sinking. Now this sinking or this is associated with the sea level rise, and the sea level rise is primarily because of two factors. One factor is the melting of snow and ice on the land areas, in the polar ice caps, etc. But the other major factor for the sea level rise is due to heating, there is a natural thermal expansion of water. So that natural thermal expansion of water endangers small islands such as in the regions of the Sundarbans, when we talk about the regions such as the Indonesian Sumatran island areas, Maldives, Lakshadweep, and even other islands that you find in the Philippine archipelago, particularly in the region around South China Sea. So they are also getting impacted by that. And then you have the impact on biodiversity. Okay, so these become basically some of the important impacts. Glacial melt will also induce the economic disasters. For example, when we talk about the agricultural loss, so when we talk about the glaciers in the region around, let's suppose the Himalayan area, in the Himalayan area itself, the glaciers end up supporting the river systems on which close to around 2 billion population is reliant in terms of water security, for domestic purposes, for cultivational purposes, and agricultural income as well. So as these glaciers melt, in the short term, they will cause flooding. But over a long run, what do these glaciers do? The glacial melt, it causes seasonality of the rivers. The rivers tend to become seasonal. Now, when the rivers become seasonal, what is the outcome of it? There will be greater conflict and more number of water wars would be waged. And also, The larger plain areas which have typically for generations and centuries relied upon the fertility of land for income level, now their income source will go away. So that creates a large population of low income group or demography in the country or in any region of South Asia. So you observe the impact in the case of the Brahmaputra river system, you observe the impact in the case of the Ganga river system, you also observe the impact, for example, in the region of the Mekong and other rivers of South Asia as well. Now, as a result of this, you also have some impact on energy security. Why? Because many of these Himalayan rivers, they have been dammed. There is construction of dam and reservoirs, not only in India, but also we have seen, for example, China being able to construct the large dams on river Brahmaputra, particularly across the region of the Bend. Now, if the flow of water becomes highly disturbed, then you can imagine that even the hydroelectric potential which can be generated is absolutely limited in its reach. So that means with the rising population and increased amount of warming, you are not able to support or supply enough amount of electricity to them as well. So that is the economic factor or the economic loss which is directly associated. Yes, you have the economic loss due to heat waves, droughts and all these extreme climate events as well. But glacial melt will have a long-term impact even in terms of the groundwater recharge, hydrological cycles in the region of Asia. Okay? Now, thereafter, when we talk about the cryosphere, that is the region of the glacier, so 23 out of the 24 glaciers in the high mountainous region of the Asian area has shown a continued decline. When we talk about the example of it, you have the example of Urumqi Glacier number 1. Now, it has recorded the most negative mass balance, as in the loss of glacial mass has been very massive, which began way early in the 1950s and 1960s, but then the loss of the glacial ice has been much more exaggerated. So the impact of the glacial loss and the impact of the cryosphere. So melting of glaciers, what are its impact? Something that we have discussed, but if we list it out, what are its impact? First impact, reduced albedo, because the glacial ice is white in appearance. So it reflects more amount of solar rays. But when that ice melts, that means what? The solar rays will be absorbed more. So as a consequence, increased land temperature. This is something which is observed in the region of Jammu Kashmir as well, particularly during the months of December and January. Every year you will come across a news story that Jammu Kashmir has experienced an ice-free December. Now, once that happens, it kicks in a chain reaction. So the land continues to get heated up and the entire cycle of climatic events that gets delayed, due to which the direct impact is rainfall cycles in the winter season in northern part of the country. And the hit that we have been taking as a country is the reduced loss or the reduced harvest of a crop that is a staple food, that is reduced harvest of wheat. So as a consequence of that, now you have heat waves occurring in the northwestern part of the country starting from the month of March itself. Earlier, those heat waves would be common in the month of April and May. But now, because the heat waves are common in the month of March, wheat crop is destroyed. And that also means that this ice-free conditions, they trigger greater amount of western disturbance, and the frequencies keep on coming all the way till the month of August as well, something that we are experiencing right now. And that is why we are experiencing Jammu Kashmir being flooded, Himachal experiencing cloudburst, Uttarakhand experiencing cloudburst, Rajasthan being flooded, and we are seeing the worst of it all. So that is associated with the increased land temperature in these areas. Okay. Then in this case, you can also have the situation where due to melting of glaciers, you have increased flooding. For the short term. Okay. Now, when you have the glacial melt and more amount of water flowing down the slopes, what does that trigger? Larger amount of mass movements. So landslides become very common in the hill slopes. So mass movements like landslides and debris flow, okay, become very common and frequent. Debris flow, that becomes very, very common. Then after that, you also have the other impact, that is rivers become seasonal. As a consequence of this, there will be greater conflict, more conflict. We are already seeing a kind of genesis of this conflict panning out in India. For example, when we see the water wars now, earlier the water conflict and river disputes in India would be restricted to peninsular rivers because they are seasonal in nature. So people or the states would vie for its availability of water. For example, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Goa, Maharashtra, they have been consistently involved in this tussle for water sharing. Himalayan states and the northern states, they always had a plentiful supply of water. But look at it, that what is happening. Punjab and Haryana, they are quarreling for the rights of more water supply. Now, this is because the water supply has been becoming much more infrequent. Look at the kind of loss of trust which is there between China and India associated with the water supply. So this becomes much more prominent, much more frequent. Then this will also impact agricultural productivity in the plain areas. Agricultural productivity. Okay. Then if the glaciers will melt, understand it from a climatological point of view. If the glaciers will melt, glaciers are the regions of high pressure, very cold conditions, high pressure. Now, that high pressure in the region of Central Asia is very important in ensuring that we get regular supply of rainfall during the monsoonal months as well. Once that high pressure does weaken, because the glacier will melt, more heating, high pressure will weaken. Once that high pressure weakens, that means you will experience distorted pattern of rainfall in various parts of the country. Northeastern part of the country might start receiving more frequent rainfall and much higher amount of flooding, whereas northwestern and central part of the country might experience prolonged drought conditions and drought seasons as well. So that is where the rainfall pattern also will get impacted. Rainfall pattern is impacted. Then after that, water security overall, and also what we have discussed about the impact on energy security. Water security and energy security. These will also be impacted. Okay. Now, the extreme events have been on the rise, be it the case of the landslides, be it the case of cyclones, more number of typhoons, they are occurring with greater ferocity. Droughts, they are causing real-time damage. And that is another report that we will consider, impact of heat waves and droughts when it comes to labor productivity in the region. Okay. Now, then after that, the importance of early warning and resilience. Now, unless and until we deploy these early warning systems, the loss which we are facing is going to be very massive. So the early warning systems need to be deployed with greater numbers. Okay, so that would involve the deployment of temperature sensors, Doppler radar systems, and also you have to ensure that you are taking the indigenous or the local community along with you. There's a participation of the local community and you have a cohesive disaster mitigation plan. what we have been seeing in the region of Uttarakhand, Himachal and Jammu Kashmir in the recent times, imagine how many lives could have been saved if you had the early warning that, okay, in this area, there is going to be a cloud burst. So that is why early warning is the way to proceed in this case. Okay. Now, after this, we come to another major topic which has been raging on for a couple of months. That is the reform in UNFCCC reforms. Now, that has been discussed and is being discussed across multiple forums. Why is it that UNFCCC requires a reform? What is this UNFCCC? For those uninitiated about it, for those of us who don't know, UNFCCC is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, this was a convention for the first time which targeted the emissions of greenhouse gases. That greenhouse gases should not be emitted beyond a certain proportion, because eventually that is leading to the planet getting warmed at an accelerated rate. Okay. Now, this UNFCCC was arrived at the Rio Summit in 1992. Rio Summit 1992. Okay. Now, this was initially backed by a protocol, that was the Kyoto Protocol, which set certain binding targets for emission standards. That what should be the amount of emission which should be carried on and so on. Okay. Now, here, which is the funding mechanism for this? Funding for this is provided by Global Environment Facility with World Bank as a trustee. Okay. Now, presently what is happening is that UNFCCC is now in 2015, the world agreed upon the wide-ranging Paris agreements. Under the case of the Paris agreements, all the countries have to declare their own contributions in the fight against climate change, what is also referred to as INDC, right? Or intended nationally determined contributions. What is your contribution when it comes to the fight against climate change? Now, India, being one of the responsible members of the Global Committee of Nations, announced certain directives that this is what we will do in our fight against climate change. We will reduce the carbon intensity of the GDP by around 30-35%. We will have increased amount of renewables to almost 40% of the total energy and so on. But in the Conference of Parties number 26, that is in 2021, which was held in Glasgow, India announced its Panchamrit goals, whereby India said that, look, we are going to reach the net zero emissions by 2070. We are going to ensure that we step up in our earlier commitments, in the sense that India has announced that almost 500 gigawatts of renewable, 50% of the overall energy will be sourced through renewables. Then when we talk about even the case of, let's suppose, carbon intensity of the GDP, that will be reduced to almost 45 to 50%. That means greening of sectors such as steel, aluminium, etc. So that is a major commitment that India has made. But the problem that UNFCCC has been facing for certain time has been lack of political will, lack of funding. Why? Because you see, ever since the case of the Kyoto Protocol, UNFCCC follows the basic principle of CBDR. That is common but differentiated responsibility. What does that mean? That while the entire world is responsible for actions against climate change, but then the globally developed nations, the economically prosperous nations such as the Western world, the northern part of the world, now they have developed on the back of exploiting the environment. So for them, the onus of responsibility is more. So they have to provide financial or technical assistance to the underdeveloped and developing nations in order to ensure that emissions of India, etc., that is not so high. But then lately, developed nations have been backtracking from their commitments. For example, earlier they had committed that we will provide almost $300 billion a year to the developing and underdeveloped nations. In reality, What was provided was even less than $100 billion. Then, one of the largest economies, or the largest economy of the world, that is US. Now, US has been backtracking from it. Now, what we observed that Barack Obama, when he was the president of US, was very instrumental in formulating a global consensus and thereby the framing of the Paris Agreement. Now, as soon as Donald Trump took over, now Donald Trump, he sees the world as he takes a look into it. That is very unique. He looks at climate change as a kind of a hoax, a conspiracy theory to pull US down. So Donald Trump immediately withdrew from the Paris Agreement. Now, once Donald Trump withdrew from Paris Agreement, that means US no longer had to fulfill its commitment for climate change, no longer requirement of funds. Now, when he left office, Joe Biden took over. Again, US joined the Paris Agreement. Again, it started telling the nations what to do, what not to do. Now, the nations, they were in a turmoil whether to follow the US lead in this or not. Immediately after that, when Trump 2.0 comes over, what did that mean? Basically, again, withdrawal from Paris Agreement. So that is what we have seen, that even in the last Conference of Party, the Conference of Party 29, which was held in Baku, Azerbaijan. Now, even in the last Conference of Party, we witnessed that across the globe, developed nations, they were backtracking from their commitments. Developed nations did not want to commit any financial aid. Why? Because they have the example that if the richest nation of the world is not ready to put any money, why should a country like Germany or France commit to greater amount of money, or Australia for that matter? Australia has also been very vociferous in its opposition to funding the underdeveloped nations. So that is where the funding mechanism has been broken. That is where countries like India, which represents a larger group of global south, now they have been demanding a special trust, a special fund getting created, because when we say the funding, now that funding is routed through Global Environment Facility, World Bank as its trustee. Now World Bank is dominated by the whims and the fantasies oftentimes of US as well. So if you are on the bad books of US, you don't get the climate funds. If you are on the good books, fair enough, you get the climate funds. So many of the countries have been discriminated against, particularly the African region and the small island nations as well. So they are asking for a special trust fund to be created, which is not being heeded to. Then countries have also been demanding the activation of loss and damage fund, the L&D fund, which was promised in the Conference of Parties number 27, operationalized in the Conference of Parties number 28, which was held in Dubai. That is when the Loss and Damage Fund was operationalized. What is this Loss and Damage Fund, by the way? That due to climate change, the losses which are being experienced in the underdeveloped nations of the world, there has to be some payment provided by the developed countries. After all, the climate change is not a result of industrialization of India or Pakistan or Bangladesh. The climate change is a result of the industrialization of North America and Europe, which has broken the ecosystem and environment. So there is a disagreement in operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund as well. Now, there have been an increased amount of observations that when we talk about the meeting of this UNFCCC, so there is an annual conference of parties. Annual conference of parties which are held. Now this annual conference of parties, now this is being utilized by the nations to make long political speeches. Every nation participates only to make long political speeches targeting their own audiences. So decisive action is not being taken in conference of parties. It is just becoming a forum for delivering the speeches. Also, the commitments, if a country is not able to meet its commitment, there is no repercussion to it. For example, as per the requirement of the Paris Agreement, now once the Paris Agreement was operationalized, when was it operationalized? 2019. Okay, so 2019 was when the Paris Agreement came into operationalization. Now, after 5 years, there has to be a global stocktake mechanism where whatever commitment the countries have made, whatever the INDC they have declared, there has to be a global stocktake that whether the countries are following that or not. Now, even the countries are not ready to go for that. So the entire decorum or the entire agreement which was finalized in the city of Paris, that has been put into abeyance. So there is a growing call for reform in the very structure of UNFCCC, because climate change is a reality and we are facing the brunt of it. Now, the context of it. So basically there has been a renewed push because this year's Conference of Parties, that is the COP30, is going to be held in Brazil. So Brazil is carrying out this climate diplomacy, reaching out to like-minded nations like India and China to push the developed nations to create certain greater amount of financial commitments that they can do. Now what happens is that you see, you have the Conference of Party, which is the highest decision-making body for any of these conventions. Okay, now that meets once a year. But then in the mid-year, you have the delegates who meet at Bonn, the Bonn Climate Conference or the Bonn Climate Grouping as it is referred to. Now there, the decisions are taken and consultations are held between the stakeholders regarding what should be done to ensure that we are more decisive in terms of our climate action and climate goals. Now that grouping met through the month of June and July. That was the mid-year meeting in Bonn. Okay, so that becomes relevant for your prelims examination. That is, what is this Bonn Climate Change Conference? Bonn Climate Change Conference, that becomes relevant for your prelims. What is it? So when we talk about the Bonn Climate Change Conference, it is a part of the mechanism of UNFCCC. It meets mid-year every year annually in order to finalize the plans and the course of action to be taken going forward before the Conference of Parties, so that because Conference of Parties is a high decision-making body, it should not be involved in politicization or documentation. Whatever the clerical requirements, whatever the negotiation requirements should be done earlier itself. That is the purpose of the Bonn meeting. So it is a mid-year summit held under the aegis of UNFCCC and formally called the Sessions of Subsidiary Bodies or SBs. Subsidiary bodies include what? So includes the various committees, delegates, NGOs, civil society organizations, all of them. Now they have suggested a massive revamp of the entire UNFCCC structure. Now as per their suggestion, they indicate that there is a lack of political will because the entire structure is such that you need a complete consensus before arriving at a decision. It is never the case that all the countries, they align in a similar manner. For example, let's suppose tomorrow developed nations have to or in a way they don't agree to give money to the underdeveloped nations, let's assume. Now all that they have to do is ensure that some of the small island nations, they align with them. And that is a significant chunk which can break the consensus. So any political action, any decisive action which can be taken immediately gets impacted. So hence the rate of decision making is very slow. Then the small island states and least developing countries often feel sidelined. Their voices are not heard on this public forum, right? Also, there has been a very damning allegation that when it comes to corporates, large corporate houses, they oftentimes hijack the entire narrative around these Conference of Parties. For example, when Conference of Parties number 28 was held in Dubai, UAE, at that point of time, you basically had the oil companies, large oil majors, because it was held in UAE. Now, large oil corporations like ADNOC and so on, they ensured that in the final directive, there is no such mention of phasing out of fossil fuels in terms of the exact date or a timeline. So corporate houses, they have started becoming more dominant a player. Okay. Now, inadequate funding. Okay, the funding is very, very minimal, very basic. So the funding requirement in order to effectively combat climate change is close to around $1.3 trillion. And what is the commitment? $300 billion, and that to 2035 onwards. So it is almost nothing. Then lack of result-oriented meetings. Meetings are mostly associated with making long political speeches. So these are some of the reasons why the Born Climate Group has been calling for reforms. And the suggestion, eliminate overlapping or redundant issue. Every country is talking about, every delegation is talking about the same thing about climate change, oceanic warming, etc. They're just making speeches, and the same thing is getting repeated again and again. So the entire conference is actually hijacked, asking countries to restrict the length of the statements, limit the size of the negotiating teams, allow majority-based decision-making rather than a complete consensus-based, because that will lead to better decision-making as well. Countries to be allowed based upon their track record. So if a country has got a good track record, they have met their nationally determined contribution, the goals, etc., then allow them to use the platform to make speeches. If a country is a defaulting nation or is a defaulter, don't give them that platform or the luxury of that platform anymore. Okay, reducing the participation and involvement of representatives of the fossil fuel organizations and companies as well, so that the corporate intervention is actually restricted. Now, the Conference of Parties number 30 is going to be held in Brazil. This year, we are fraught with major problems. The problems such as, when we talk about participation of US, it is not happening. Climate commitments, not happening. When we talk about funding, not happening. So that is a dilemma that Brazil is facing right now. On top of it, when US has imposed these tariffs, that means it has pushed Brazil into a corner where it can no longer negotiate so healthily with the developed nations when it comes to the funding requirements. So that is the limitation that countries like Brazil, they face. Okay, so that is the precursor to the Conference of Parties. Now this becomes important for your mains examination. UNFCCC is in need for urgent reforms in order to prevent irrelevance that it can face. Comment. Now, what do you write? How do you write this answer? 15-marker answer. So always when you write this answer, in the introduction, address the keyword. What is the keyword in this? The keyword in this is UNFCCC. So that is what you have to mention in the introduction. You do have to mention that United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is a first of its kind convention arrived at Rio Summit 1992 in order to target the emission of greenhouse gases, whereby the aim is to limit the level of warming to below 2 degrees Celsius as compared to the industrial level by 2100. That will be your introduction. Now, after that, before you start talking about the need for the reforms, you do also need to mention that, for example, the annual meetings which happen, Conference of Parties, you do need to mention that the highest decision-making body is the Conference of Parties. You mention about them, you mention or you talk about the details, a couple of lines, last where was it held, next where it is going to be held, and the consensus-based decision-making, the funding mechanism by GEF, which is managed by World Bank. Then you talk about the reasons why reforms are required, and then you list them out. Eventually, you have to mention that this entire decision making, which was the purpose of UNFCCC, has been put under abeyance, and we have not seen any major landmark action in the fight against climate change, where the world is coming together. Rather, the world is being fragmented at the platform of UNFCCC. Going ahead into the future, where climate change is already upon us, the need of the hour is to ensure that UNFCCC is a functioning body and is a healthy organization capable to take decisions. Like that, you can conclude the answer. Okay? Now, after this, we come to another topic which has been in news that is India and its preparedness against GLOFs. What do we understand by GLOFs? GLOFs are basically glacial lake outburst flood. So, in the high mountainous regions, wherever you have the case of the glacial lakes, now there are certain things which are happening due to climate change. First of all, and understand this chain. So, in the case of climate change, what is happening? Due to climate change, the temperature is experiencing an increase. As a consequence, glacial melt, rate of glacial melt is increasing. Glacial melt is increasing. You have the receding of the glaciers or glacial retreat. What does that mean? Size of the glacial lakes are also increasing massively. Glacial lakes, this is increasing. Now, in the case of the subcontinent like India, these glacial lakes are to be found where? In high altitude regions, isn't it? So, when the size of the glacial lakes are increasing in high altitude areas, that means danger associated with GLOF events, that is also becoming more frequent. GLOF events in themselves are becoming much more frequent. Okay. Now, this was again a detailed article which was done in the case of Down to Earth magazine, also reported by the Hindu. So, that is where it becomes important. So, here, when we take a look at these glacial lake outburst flood, what is the glacial lake outburst flood? So, let's suppose you consider a mountainous area. Now, in the mountainous area, if let's suppose you have the presence of the glacial ice in this entirety of the region, due to increased amount and increased rate of melting, this glacial ice melts to form a large lake of sorts. Now, this will be referred to as the condition or a glacial lake. Okay. Now, if the water level in this goes up, means what? This water can overflow, and then when the water overflows, that means it will come down from a height, so the kinetic and the potential energy that it will have will be massive. It will bring with it large amount of debris, landslide, etc., which will be a common instance. In Sikkim, in Uttarakhand, in Himachal Pradesh, we have experienced loss of life and property due to this event of GLOF. So that is the case of GLOF. Okay, so they are disaster events caused by abrupt discharge of water from the glacial lakes. Observe this. This is the example or representation of a glacial lake. Imagine if the glacial melt is more, means what? Water level in this will increase, isn't it? Now, if the glacial melt brings with it the rocks, the stone pieces, etc., this glacial lake can always overflow, right? So, as the glacial withdraws, it leaves behind a depression that eventually gets filled with the melt water. Now, climate change's role. Now, as more and more recession is observed in the case of the glacial lakes, means what? The lake becomes larger, right? Now, in this case, most of the lakes, as I have indicated with the image as well, most of the lakes are dammed or are protected by deposits such as moraines, rock deposits, and so on. Okay, so most of these sedimentary rocks are very loose, right? They are not tightly held together, so they are prone to failure, and that can cause GLOF events. Okay, now they can be triggered by various reasons. Seismicity can also trigger GLOFs, increased melting can also trigger GLOFs, right? So over a period of time, when the size increases, that can also trigger GLOFs. If avalanches occur in the higher slopes, that can also trigger GLOF events. When we talk about the glaciers in India, there are broadly two different types of glacial presence that you will observe in the Indian region or the subcontinental region. One is basically the supraglacial areas. Supraglacial regions. What are these supraglacial regions? Where within the glacial ice itself, you have the meltwater. This is supraglacial. Okay, you can observe that the entirety of the region is frozen, and in between you have the accumulation of meltwater. The other is moraine dammed glaciers. Moraine dammed glaciers. Now, due to climate change, now this moraine that you see, this is the deposit that we were talking about, loose sedimentary deposits. Now, when the water exceeds a particular level, this becomes weaker and this is prone to slope failure. That is where all this glacial water can come down slope very quickly. So the danger is more in the moraine dammed glaciers, which are increased or which are to be found in larger numbers as compared to the supraglacial lakes that you find in very high altitudes. Okay. Now, situation in the Himalayas, this is the case study that you can see where across the Indus River Basin, the Gepang Ghat region, that has experienced a 178% increase in the size of the lake. Okay, so earlier what was the size was basically 36.49 hectares. It has increased to almost more than 100 hectares. So you can imagine the potential disaster causing ability of that. Now, impact of GLOF can trigger mass movement, can trigger these landslides, and we also know that whenever you have these GLOF events, there is an associated water security problem as well. Why? Because whenever you have the emptying of these glacial lakes, the general and the regular supply for the streams of the Himalayan rivers and the streams of the mountainous regions, that gets impacted. And that will always impact the downstream regions as well. So that is the case of the impact of glacial lakes. So first of all, you will have disaster due to landslides, and mass movement, right? Flooding downstream, then you will also have the case of impact on water security. Okay. Now, what can be done for mitigation? So, National Disaster Management Authority has tried to bring in the local community as well and scientific study in order to, and scientific measure in order to mitigate this disaster. So that is a work which is being done by the NDMA. Okay, so there was a plan which was launched and there was a committee which was formed, that is the Committee on Disaster Risk Reduction. Right. Now this CODRR, now initially it has basically identified certain disaster prone districts which are prone to be experiencing these GLOF events. Okay, so earlier 56 glacial lakes which were considered to be at risk, they were identified and there was a fund allocation which was provided. Now that has increased to 195 various different glacial lakes as well. Now, objectives of the national program: hazard assessment of each at-risk glacial lake, installing automated weather and water stations, establishing early warning systems downstream so that you can mitigate the disaster cost, mitigating risk by drawing down water level or building retention structures, and community engagement is an important factor. Now, there are certain measures which have been taken. So here, when we talk about these measures, they also span into the scientific realm. So what are the scientific measures? More expeditions are launched in these disaster-prone regions, GLOF-prone regions. More such expeditions are being launched. Bathymetry to understand the volume of these glacial lakes, because only then will we be able to understand the stability of the region and the stability of the glacial lake structure as well. Now, UAVs and slope stability survey for terrain mapping, indigenous technology such as the radiometry which is carried out in order to understand the slope stability as well. So these are the scientific measures which can be talked about. Now, the question which can be expected, what are GLOFs? Discuss about its increasing prevalence and measures to mitigate the damage caused by these GLOFs. So, introduction has to talk about what do you understand by GLOFs. Okay, that is what you have to start talking about it. And then after that, basically, why these GLOF-based incidents are happening due to climate change, what is their impact, and increasing prevalence, why it is happening, and the measures, both scientific and overall policy-based objective. Now, WHO and WMO report, so World Health Organization and the World Meteorological Organization, they have come up with the climate change and the workplace heat stress report 2025. Now, this report talks about the case that when you have the incidence of climate change and rising temperature, due to which the productivity of the workforce that starts to dwindle, that starts to decline. Okay, and when the productivity starts to decline, then the economic output, and also basically due to heat stress, the occurrences of workplace-based occupational hazards, accidents, that becomes common. The case of casualties, that starts to increase. So that is basically the WHO WMO report. So it is brought in conjunction with a complementary study done by International Labour Organization also. That has also brought in the case of the complementary study here. Okay. Now, they have jointly published the report. It highlights the health challenges associated with heat waves. Heat waves are caused by climate change, but what is the economic outcome of it? That is associated with this. Complementary findings brought about by International Labour Organization. Okay. Now, what are the key findings that becomes relevant for the exam? As is the case for the past few years, 2024 is the warmest year on record as per World Meteorological Organization. Extreme temperatures events are very common. We have been seeing that in India as well, where from the month of March, April itself, we start experiencing temperature in the excess of 40 degrees Celsius. Now, those daily wage earners, construction workers, agricultural laborers who work out in the open, they get impacted, and that causes heat wave induced illnesses and also heat stroke, otherwise casualties as well. Now, in the case of these migrant laborers, the daily wage earners, oftentimes they are the only sole earning member in the entire family. So once they get impacted, family's income level also gets impacted. That means if a poor family is spending on healthcare, out-of-pocket expenditure is increasing, that means their ability to buy other goods, that is less. So disposable income reduces. And when the disposable income reduces, means what? The demand in the economy goes down. So it has got a long-term economic damage and capable to bring down the economic productivity and GDP overall as well. Okay. Now, global workforce exposure to the heat waves is more than around 2.4 billion people. They are experiencing extreme climate events. Productivity rate starts to go down. So, you will observe that worker productivity drops by 2 to 3% for every degree above 20 degrees Celsius. And imagine in a country like India, we are frequently experiencing that around 40 degree, 45 degree in the month of March, April, right? So this exposure leads to various occupational injuries, more accidents at the workplace, they become prominent, okay? And approximately half of the global population is experiencing the impact of it. Now, this is the chart that the report has published about the wet bulb global temperature scale, right? Wet bulb global temperature scale. What is the wet bulb temperature? It was asked in this year's prelims as well. Wet bulb temperature, so that is the minimum temperature which is experienced after evaporation as well. So across the world, when you take a look at the wet bulb temperature, it is increasing around 35, 30 degree, 32 degree very commonly. Even in Indian subcontinent, you observe that the wet bulb temperature scale is indicating a pattern in between 30 to 34 degrees Celsius, which means what? That even after sweating, after perspiration, you are experiencing a temperature in the excess of 34, 35 degrees Celsius. That means, remember, the productivity starts reducing by 2 to 3% with every rise in temperature beyond 20 degrees Celsius. And here we are experiencing a temperature 15 degrees Celsius in excess. So the productivity level goes down, heat strokes become common, casualties during the summer season also tends to increase. Okay? Now, after that, who is vulnerable? The report has indicated that the manual workers who operate on the ground under open environment, they are the most vulnerable. Even in the young population or the adult population, if you consider those suffering from chronic diseases, they also are very vulnerable due to the impact of it. Middle-aged and older workers, individuals with chronic health conditions, and those with lower physical fitness, they also end up suffering, right? So that is the vulnerable population. What is the recommended strategy? Frame a detailed plan in each of the occupational spaces, understanding the local weather pattern, understanding who is the vulnerable population, what is the job that they are doing, and then make a plan. It should not be and it cannot be one size fits all kind of a planning which can be done. For everyone, you need a detailed and a different plan associated. Focus on vulnerable population to reduce the illnesses associated with heat stroke. Education and awareness raising is also important in the larger population, what they can do in order to ward off that heat stress. Okay, frequent drinking of water, having that water source along with them, that is an important part that many of them, they tend to ignore. Engage all stakeholders, that is the workers, the trade unions, the health experts, all of them have to be brought about and in consonance in order to develop a detailed framework strategy. Design practical and sustainable solutions overall. Innovation has to be provided. For example, Japan has taken a lead in this by coming up with the specialized jackets which are now used in other regions like Korea as well, where you have the fan technology allowing the movement of air inside those jackets. So that protects you in the harshest of the summer conditions as well. Support further research and evaluation in terms of understanding the impact in each sector, in each district, in each region. Okay, so that is about the case of the report. Here also, relevant for the mains examination, discuss the impact of climate change and heat stress on the economic productivity of the workforce. So here, please bring that entire concept or the entire cycle of impacted due to lower productivity, also falling ill, that means out-of-pocket expenditure increases, that means disposable income reduces, that means ability to generate demand in the economy also gets impacted. Okay. Now, after that, coming to certain places in news which have been in news for some reason or the other. Starting with Madei Wildlife Sanctuary. So its location is important, and also what is important is to understand the important species in this area. So where is this Madei Wildlife Sanctuary situated? It is situated in the laps of the Western Ghats in the region of Goa. So in Goa, you have two of the major wildlife sanctuaries. One is Bhagwan Mahavir and one is Madei Wildlife Sanctuary. These are the two major protected areas. Now, Madei owing to the name of the river which drains through it. So it is a nesting ground of critically endangered long-billed vulture. Okay, so the unique species associated. What is the vegetation that you can find in the region? Moist deciduous. Okay, because it is on the western side of the Western Ghats, the rainfall is high, so either evergreen or moist deciduous, right? In the region, you will also find lot of sacred grove population to be found. The fauna, Indian gaur, tigers, barking deer, that is munyak, sambar deer, Indian hare, and so on. Now, known for the presence of the big four snake species of India. So which are the big four snake species? Indian krait, Russell's viper, then saw-scaled viper, spectacled cobra. These are referred to as the big four venomous snakes of India. It is an international bird area, and here you will find Malabar parakeet amongst one of the species, Malabar parakeet and Rufus babbler. Okay, these are your species of birds. Okay, now this is the case of the Russell's viper, one of the deadliest snake that you find in the region of India. So it is to be found in the plain areas and the coastal lowlands, very much common in the region of the Western Ghats as well. But it is not only to be restricted into India, it is to be found in the surrounding regions of Asian continent as well. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, Cambodia, everywhere you will find these. Okay, and it is one of the big four. Spectacled cobra, then you have Indian krait. These are some of the other types. Okay, so it is basically they give birth to about 30 young from the eggs that are hatched within the body. So this is the animal behavior that is relevant for the prelims. Now, Panna Tiger Reserve. Panna Tiger Reserve, where is it situated? So it is situated in the region of Madhya Pradesh. Okay, I hope we are able to observe this. Location becomes important because once you know the location, you can automatically deduce the physiographic condition as well. Now, it is an important wildlife corridor as well, important biodiversity corridor as well. So, located in the Vindhyan mountain range in the northern part of Madhya Pradesh, spread over Panna and Chhatarpur districts of Madhya Pradesh. Now, which is the river draining through this protected area? It is River Ken. That is why in the case of Ken-Betwa interlink, this Panna wildlife region that is at risk and that needs conservation or protection. Okay, major vegetation is dry deciduous. That is why the herbivore population is more, which has supported a large tiger population in the region as well. Now, endangered animals like tiger, leopard and chinkara, they are to be found, also home to the carasal. Carasal is what is also known as a siagosh because of the black ear that it has. Now, carasal is endangered in India, whereas when we talk about the region of the other areas of West Asia, Middle East, that is where the population is healthy. Okay, but in India, because of the destruction of the semi-arid landscape, carasal population has been declining. Jungle cats are also to be found in the region. Okay. Now, in the case of the Panna region, location and also the river becomes relevant. Then Kanha Tiger Reserve. Now, when we say Kanha Tiger Reserve, again, where is it situated? In the boundary margin zones between Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. So, Panna was to the north here. Then, when we talk about Kanha, it is to the east. Okay. Now, it is located in the Maikal ranges of the Satpuras and one of the largest national park when it comes to Madhya Pradesh. Okay. Now, active corridor between, it is an active corridor between the Kanha and the Pech Tiger Reserves, and that becomes important for the conservation of the wild species as well. Okay. And this is the forest, by the way, and this is the region of the vegetation which has been described in Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. You would have seen various iterations of Jungle Book. You would have read about Jungle Book. You would have seen movies made on the Jungle Book. That Jungle Book is based on this Kanha Tiger Reserve. Okay, local communities like Gonds and the Baigas are also to be found in the region. And one important trivia is, this is the first tiger reserve to have its own mascot, Bhur Singh the Barasingha. That is the mascot of the Kanha Tiger Reserve. Okay, so here again, moist deciduous forest as well as some of the dry deciduous forest means large population of herbivore. However, in this region, we are experiencing the increased invasive alien species population, that is Lantana camara. Lantana camara, that number or their number has been increasing, which is leading to a reduced population of the herbivores because the herbivores don't find it palatable. Once the herbivore population is declining, as a consequence, the carnivore population is also declining. Okay. Then Salkhan Fossil Park was also in news. Now this is associated with the great oxidation event that planet Earth experienced with the genesis of the species. So I hope we are aware that when planet Earth was created, oxygen was not present in its atmosphere in the amount that we have today. But with the genesis of species, you have the cyanobacterium and the blue-green bacterium. They started coming into existence. Underwater body, obviously. They started producing oxygen, which made the atmosphere abundant with oxygen. Now, these are very, very old species. The fossils of these species are to be found in certain areas. So that is the Salkhan Fossil Park in the region of Uttar Pradesh. So it is also known as the Sonbhadra Fossil Park in the region of Uttar Pradesh, nestled amongst the region of the Kaimur and the Vindhyan mountain range. Okay, because Kaimur extends all the way to the region of southwestern Bihar. So Kaimur and the Vindhyan mountain range, home to repository of fossils dating back almost 1.4 billion years. This is how these older fossils, they appear to look like. This is around almost 1.4 billion years. Okay. So when we talk about fossil assemblage scattered across various formations, they are primarily the case of stromatolites. Okay. And these are the formations of communities of cyanobacterium. Okay. Now, the rationale behind Nath Brahmer, the rationale behind monthly current affairs, you see, when you follow the daily current affairs, you are only following the news reportage of the Hindu. But UPSC will not always restrict itself to Hindu. Hindu is a basic material that is required to be studied, isn't it? So, you need to have coverage of each of the topics from the Indian Express, from Down to Earth, from the websites out there. Many of the times, the Hindu does not bring those articles. So how do you ensure your comprehensive preparation? It is for that purpose. Okay. So that is the reason for these sessions. It is to ensure that you have a comprehensive preparation across the spectrum. Okay. Now, it is home to prehistoric stromatolite population, cyanobacterium, which would be underwater, which would release large amount of oxygen and carry out the great oxidation event. Okay. Now, diversity of stromatolite, that is very massive, ranging from domal in a dome shape to a columnar shape, indicating the life form in the Proterozoic era and the pre-Cambric age as well, how the life form would have been. Now, Namdapha Tiger Reserve is in use owing to the species which has been sighted. This species has been sighted after a long time in this region. So what is that? White-eared night heron that has been camera trapped. Okay, so this is your white-eared night heron. Primarily found in southern China and the region of Vietnam, global population less than 1,000, and it is very secretive and nocturnal in nature. That is why not easily captured. Now, this has been sighted in the region of Namdapha Tiger Reserve. So where is Namdapha? Namdapha Tiger Reserve is situated in the eastern extremity of the country, in the state of Arunachal Pradesh, right near the border. Okay. Now, when we talk about the region of Namdapha, so India and Myanmar, along with the, at the border of India and Myanmar, within the Changlang district in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. That is where the location is. Okay. Now, you will have the physiographic features which are relevant for the prelims. What are the physiographic features? So, in the region of the Dafa Bum Ridge of the Mishmi Hills and the area of the Patkai Bum Ridge. That is where you will find them. Common boundary with Kamlang Sanctuary and Namdapha River flows through the region. Then, certain species which have been in use. Indri lemur. Indri lemur has also been asked in the prelims examination, by the way. When we say Indri lemur, which region of the world it is to be found in and what is the conservation status? So it is to be found in the region of Madagascar. Okay. it is isolated in terms of the distribution of species because of the location of the region of Madagascar, and it is critically endangered. Okay, so Indri lemur, this is the pictographic image of Indri lemur. It is typically to be found in the region of Madagascar. So it is the largest of the surviving lemur species which do exist, found only in the remote part of northeastern Madagascar. Asked in the prelims for match the following. So when you think about where these species are being picked up from, these species are typically being picked up from the places in news or the species in news. Okay, coastal and montane rainforest. So from the sea level up to an elevation of almost 1800 meters, you will find them. And they have a rudimentary tail and large hands and feet. That is the feature of the organism. Now, other than that, it is critically endangered, active during the day, and arboreal, does not move on the ground, moves through the trees. Okay, so it is arboreal and it is diurnal in terms of its behavior. Diurnal. Okay, then the next species, again something which has been asked in the prelims, is the Kharai camel. Kharai camel typically found in the marshland and the salt pan areas. Now this is the camel species which can swim as well, right? In the mangrove rich regions, they are known to swim from one small island to another and thereby fetch for the food. The name Kharai is derived from khara, which basically refers to the presence of salty conditions. Okay, so where is Kharai camel to be found? Typically in the region of the Run of Kutch, in the region of Gujarat. So it is indigenous to Gujarat, derives the name from the local term khara, which means saline. It has the ability to swim for long distances in search for the mangroves that it will graze. Okay, now it has been preserved by the Rabri and the Fakirani Jat tribes for almost 400 years. So that is where the tribal population in the region is also important. What we studied in the case of the Kanhas is Kanha Tiger Reserve as well, and even for the species. So which are the species, which are the tribes associated with that needs to be paid attention to. So primarily, where do they exist? Do they exist in Rajasthan? No. Primarily exist in the region of Kutch. Okay, and they are very vital in maintaining and propagation of the mangrove ecosystem, which is to be found in the coastal landscape. Okay, so Rajasthan will be the easy conclusion and derivation, but don't go for it is associated with the region of Kutch. Now the milk of this Kharai camel is always in great demand, owing to the therapeutic properties which are very similar in terms of the human milk as well, right? And it is easier to digest and to boost the immune system. This species is considered to be endangered. The last topic or the last species, that is the case of Spartius carigiri. Now this is a spider species to be found in the region of Karnataka. So the researchers have identified a new species of jumping spiders, and that has been named as Spartius carigiri. It is for the first time that this genre of spider is to be found in India. Earlier it was to be expected only in the region of Southeast Asia and Africa, but now in the region of Elephant Hills in Karnataka, it is to be found for the first time. Okay, now this spider is also very unique for the intelligent hunting skills, and they have a very keen eyesight. Now they start mimicking or the behavior of the other prey species, and like that they are able to capture the other spider species as well. So that is the case of this Spartius carigiri. What do you need to know? Where are they to be found? Karnataka, Elephant Hills. Typically, in which other areas jumping spiders are to be found? Southeast Asia, Africa. What is unique about them? Their hunting ability. They are predatory species. Okay, so these are the things that you need to know. So this brings us to the conclusion of the discussion for various different topics which have been in news for the portion of environment ecology, important ones for the past couple of, for the month of July and August. All that you need to do is ensure that you revise them, make a separate notes, for the species and the protected areas in use, and ensure that this consolidated file is revised multiple times before you enter the prelims exam hall, and you will be the confident candidate who comes out of the prelims without worrying about the mains exam. So that will be all from us today. If you have liked the session, please don't forget to bless us with the like, share and the subscribe button. And till we meet again, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.